this that will help them. Now, because we didn't, in my previous YouTube video and in my previous lessons, I actually didn't get to evaluate and verify. So if you're up to that stage, or you think you will be soon, this is a good chance for you to take a few notes and understand what evaluate and verify is all about, so you're ready to do your PSMT. So the first things first, in your task, and in every PSMT you're going to get from now until the end of year 12, you're going to have this scaffold, which teaches you what you need to do in each section. So if we look at evaluate and verify now, it says evaluate the reasonable, I might use my pointer here. It says evaluate the reasonableness of your data and calculations. It says use the results from the sample to make a prediction about what Mr. Hughes could expect to see in the target population. So this is what we call extrapolation, which is where we take what we know and we make predictions about the future, I suppose. Okay, so we're taking knowledge that we know about our sample. So we know that these students in this particular year 8 class have said this about how long they spend on social media, for example, and we want to take that information and make a prediction about what the rest of the school would do based on that data that we have. Now, you might just say, okay, I think the data is going to be exactly the same. Or you might say, I think year 8 students are probably less likely to use social media than older students. And therefore, if the average social media use in hours was 2 hours for year 8s, I think it might be 3 hours for the rest of the school because they're older, or something like that. Okay, so you're taking what you know and using some assumptions, and you're going to predict about the future. That's this first dot point here. What could Mr. Hughes expect to see in the target population? We also have to identify and discuss strengths of your investigation. So strengths are things that make the results reasonable. It's things that make the data seem accurate, things that you can rely on, things that you did well, okay? As opposed to identifying and discussing the limitations, which you also have to do, whereas limitations are things that might make your data a little bit unreliable, things that maybe you rushed or you did poorly or you didn't focus very heavily on, maybe things that you omitted, meaning that you didn't include them. These are all things that can make your results less reliable, and so that's what a limitation is. After you've done those things, so first, make a prediction about what Mr. Hughes could expect to see, identify and discuss strengths of the investigation, identify and discuss limitations of the investigation. We then need to evaluate the reasonableness of our investigation by addressing the strengths and limitations of the sample. So you've discussed here the strengths, you've discussed here the limitations, and now what we do is we don't just do that for no reason. The purpose of identifying those strengths and limitations is so that we can evaluate the reasonableness. Okay, we make a judgment. That's what evaluate means, and I'm going to annotate that right now, in fact, because that's really important. Evaluate means, I'll write this in blue. You put my iPad in front of me here. Evaluate means make a judgment. Meaning, if we're evaluating reasonableness, we're making a judgment about the reasonableness. Is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? Now, there's no correct answer here. It's fully based on, and I'm going to continue highlighting, by addressing the strengths and limitations. So if you look at your strengths and limitations and you say, wow, I've got heaps of strengths and only a couple limitations, then you can probably say, yeah, my results are actually very reasonable because I have all of these strengths, things that are in my favor, things that are making my assessment really valid and reasonable, but not many limitations holding it back. Or you might find the opposite. You might say, yeah, I've only got 1 or 2 strengths, but I've got heaps of limitations, heaps of things holding me back from having a reasonable result. And therefore, I'm concluding that the results from my investigation were not reasonable. Okay, you're not going to get, there's no correct answer, so you're not going to get marked down either way. As long as you make a judgment, so say it's reasonable or it is not reasonable, based on these things, based on these strengths and limitations. What we don't want, and what happens all the time, and it's understandable, but try not to fall into this trap, okay? One thing we find students do is they say, it's reasonable because of all these strengths, but it's also unreasonable because of all these limitations. And it's kind of like, no, it can't be reasonable and unreasonable. It's only one or the other, okay? And sure, it might be really close. You might have 4 strengths and 5 limitations, but that kind of means it's more unreasonable than it is reasonable, and therefore you have to state that. Now, it is okay to say, look, I've got strengths and limitations, and so there's pros and cons to my results. However, ultimately, at the end of the day, it is either reasonable or unreasonable. You have to make that judgment. That's what evaluating means. So if you're not making a judgment, if you're kind of like sitting on the fence and saying, oh, it could be, it might not be, you're not really answering the question. I'm going to mark you down. What you need to do is make that judgment call and do it confidently, but with reacting to the evidence you have in strengths and limitations. So that's often tricky for students to do. It's totally understandable to kind of say, oh, I don't want to commit either way in case I'm wrong, but please take solace and understand that there is no wrong answer as long as you make that judgment call, reasonable or unreasonable, based on the evidence that you have and that you've discussed above, which kind of implies, if that's such a big deal, using that evidence, that really implies to me, and hopefully implies to you, that these 2 red highlighters, strengths and limitations, are so important. They are so important because they guide your reasonableness. So if you do them poorly or not very well at all, you're going to have a hard time evaluating the reasonableness of your solutions. So think carefully about your strengths and limitations and use them to decide if you're reasonable or not. And the last thing we need to do is discuss or think about, if Mr. Hughes was to do this again, how could he make the investigation fairer? Okay, so that's a little hint right there. I'll use a different color to highlight this one. Fairer is the word there. That's the main thing we want to focus on improving, which means if there's going to be things that Mr. Hughes could improve upon, then there must be limitations to this model. There must be limitations to this investigation. So these limitations are definitely, at least some of them, are definitely going to relate to how fair the investigation was, the bias that might have existed in the investigation. So make sure you consider that, and then just discuss ways that Mr. Hughes could improve it. So for example, if you had a limitation, I don't want to give one away because I want you to actually critically think. So I'm going to use one that is completely not true. Okay. Let's say you came up with a limitation that said, oh, Mr. Hughes, his name is Mr. Hughes, and therefore he has bias. Not true, obviously. I'm just making something up. If you want to go down and discuss what he could do to make it fairer, maybe if that is a true limitation, he would need to change his name before conducting this investigation. So you identify what makes it unfair, and then you recommend a change to make it fair, I guess is my main point. That was a really bad analogy, but I hope you understand my main point there. So that's what you have to do in evaluate and verify. That's how you read your task, okay? Because by the way, yes, it helps when I go through this and I explain to you, I highlight, I annotate. That makes it easy for you to understand that. But I want to teach you to read this yourself, okay? So that's one of the skills I'm actually teaching you when we do these PSMTs, is how to understand a problem, and then how to create a plan to go about solving it, and then actually solve it. And you'll notice those are directly 3 steps from Polya's problem-solving strategy that we teach you. Understand the problem, which is C. Come up with a plan, which is plan, and then solve the problem, which is do. So in our case, for this PSMT, it is highlight and annotate and understand what you need to write, come up with a plan, which is going to be our scaffold, and then actually solve that. So now that we've understood the problem, hopefully, I'm going to go down to the scaffold, which you also have, by the way, and look for the evaluate and verify section here. And you'll notice that you've got some headings, and you just need to fill in the gaps with your new understanding of what you need to do. So this first heading says, how do these findings of your sample translate to all students at Southport State High School? Meaning, based on the sample you have, what can we predict about the target population? I would hope that you don't go as simple as saying the average time spent exercising for students in this year 8 class was 3 hours a week. So therefore the rest of the schools exercise for 3 hours a week. Okay, that's so basic. If you conclude that it would be the same for the school as the class, that's fine, but you need to provide reasons that you think it would be exactly the same. Okay. For example, yeah, I can't really think of one off the top of my head, and I don't want to give anything away, but if you're making a judgment about the rest of the population based on the sample, just give me some reasons why you believe that. You might believe that students in older grades would exercise more. You might believe that students in older grades would exercise less. It doesn't really matter as long as you provide me reasons why you think the sample would change to the population, or you might think it stays the same, but again, give me reasons why. Then you have to do your strengths and limitations about how Mr. Hughes conducted the survey. Super important. Strengths and limitations are all about processes, the model, the method, that sort of thing, not things like, oh, I'm not very good at statistics, so I might have made some mistakes. That's a limitation. No, it's not. That just means that you're not fully competent at maths. It means you need to practice your maths, but it's not a limitation of the model. Okay, so when you're thinking about strengths and limitations, think about what Mr. Hughes did when he conducted the survey that was good. That's a strength. What he did that was bad, that's a limitation. Okay. And there's some examples there about what you can discuss. You can discuss sampling technique, sample size, the questioning technique. Was it biased, unbiased? Random sampling, is that good? Is that bad? That sort of thing. Okay. After you've listed your strengths and limitations, it doesn't have it here because this is a basic scaffold, but I would highly recommend write down what the strength is. You can do that in dot points, but then discuss what that means. Okay. So if you say the sampling size was a strength, don't just write in strengths sampling size. That doesn't mean anything to me because I don't understand why you think it's a strength. I need you to write in strengths if you believe it is a strength. I'm not saying it is, but if you believe sample size was a strength, you write sample size in the strengths column and then explain to me why that's a strength. Or if it's a limitation, you write it in the limitations column, sample size, and you explain to me why it's a limitation. That's key, okay? And lastly, well, second last thing, is to evaluate the reasonableness. We talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to harp on about it, but refer to your strengths and limitations to make your judgment and do decide. Don't fence it. Decide, are your results reasonable or unreasonable and why? Okay. And lastly, what elements of the investigation should be changed to make it fairer? Again, refer to your limitations, but discuss why those limitations need to be changed and also how they can be changed to create a fairer survey. Okay, and then if you didn't show your working in Solve because you just wanted to put the answers there, you put them in Appendix. All right.